We want to thank, of course, our sponsors for being here for us and allowing us to bring this great program to you. Tonight, we have Alnylam with us, and they are going to be presenting their phase 1 clinical trial for you. So stay tuned for that, please. And I'm going to start. So I'm Carrie Enoch. I'm the Campaign and Programs Director for the IgA Nephropathy Foundation. My 16-year-old has IgA nephropathy. She was diagnosed when she was 8. As of, I believe it was our last 2 weeks ago, she's in remission now, so we are doing great. There's definite hope out there because she has done everything from rituximab treatments to 18 months of prednisone, all the things. So there's definitely hope out there, and especially with these clinical trials. And now I'm going to introduce you to Bonnie and Ed. They are the founders of the IgA Nephropathy Foundation.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining in. We were really hoping that we could all be together and share the couple days and just be a big family, but COVID got in the way, and here we are, and happy to be able to present these 10 sessions to help educate you about our disease. And just to give you a very quick picture, 16 years ago, our son was diagnosed with IgA nephropathy, and I was tear up at this point. And I was looking for a place to find other parents that were going through the same thing, and we couldn't find anybody, so we started one. So that's how the IgA Nephropathy Foundation started, and we're super happy to be 16 years later being able to bring you all of this great stuff. And that's my husband behind me.
Hello, how are you? Thank you all for being here, and we try our hardest to do everything we can, and I know you all do too. So let's just find a cure. Thanks.
Amen.
Thanks, guys. So now I'm going to introduce Stuart Miller. He is the Director of Strategic Planning for the IgA Nephropathy Foundation. And Stuart is the jack of all trades. He's got his hand in everything. He is also an ambassador for the AAKP and the National Kidney Foundation. And in addition to all his advocacy efforts, Stuart also runs his own wholesale housewares business, and I don't know how he does it all. So Stuart, it's all you.
Great, thanks, Carrie. I appreciate the introduction, everybody. I'll be your moderator for tonight's event. In 2007, I was diagnosed with IgA nephropathy and managed to live with it without going on dialysis until 2018, when I received a living donor kidney transplant from my wife via a peer exchange program, and kind of my new lease on life. And that's the reason why I find the need to be involved with the foundation to help others and hopefully spread my story so everybody can learn from it. I'm excited about being part of the leadership team, and we got a great group of people, and we're really looking forward to building the foundation and hoping to find a cure. Tonight, our first speaker is Dr. Dana Rissick. And Dr. Rissick is a professor of medicine at the Division of Nephrology at University of Alabama, Birmingham. Her current clinical research interests revolve around glomerular diseases, including IgA nephropathy. In 2020, she was appointed medical director of the Clinical Trials Administrative Office. And tonight, she's going to speak to us about understanding lab results. So please, let's welcome Dr. Rissick.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. If not, please let me know. Okay, I got a thumbs up. I want to thank the sponsors and specifically the organizers for making this event possible, COVID and all. So I think, I've attended a few of these sessions. They've been wonderful, even virtually. So Bonnie, don't worry about that. Specifically, I want to thank Carrie and Bonnie for giving me this opportunity to talk to you tonight. Thank you, Stuart, for the kind introduction. And I really appreciate your help moderating, but also keeping an eye on the chat box so we can answer as many questions as possible. So I was tasked today to help you understand your labs, which I think is an extremely important topic. As a treating physician, there's nothing more encouraging than having a patient engaged in their care. And for them to be engaged in their care, they really have to understand what's going on. And labs come first, especially for nephrology or kidney diseases in general. So With that, I hope that I can make them a little less mysterious today and again, answer as many questions as possible. These are my disclosures. As Stuart mentioned, I am involved in clinical research for glomerular diseases, IgA in particular. So a lot of this research is for funding of these clinical trials that I'm involved in. I do serve as a consultant for a few companies, again, in the realm of IgA nephropathy. And I'm part owner of a startup company called Reliant Glycosciences that is looking to develop biomarkers that can help diagnose, but also hopefully follow the disease course of IgA nephropathy without having to do repeat biopsies along the way. So none of this is today relevant to the talk that I'm going to give you, so there's really no conflict with what I'm going to talk about today. Just a quick outline. So today I'm going to hopefully help you navigate what normal kidney function looks like, how do we assess kidney function, specifically talking about glomerular filtration rate and proteinuria, or the level of protein in the urine, which are two terms you are probably very familiar with, and I hope to demystify them. And then we're going to also go over some of the major metabolic complications that happen when people have chronic kidney disease and show you the labs that we as physicians do to monitor for these metabolic complications. Oops. Here we go. All right, so let's start with a case of a patient that I've seen in clinic. Mr. C is a 42-year-old African-American male with biopsy-proven IgA nephropathy who was coming for a clinic follow-up. His labs on the day of the clinic showed a creatinine value of 1.7 milligram per deciliter. His estimated GFR, or glomerular filtration rate, was 56 milliliter per minute adjusted for his body surface area. Urine analysis showed 2+ protein, 1+ blood. A 24-hour urine collection showed a 24-hour creatinine of 1,456 milligrams, 24-hour urine protein of 2,400 milligrams, and a spot urine protein to creatinine ratio of 1.6 gram per gram. 6 months ago, we noted that his labs were as follows. His creatinine was 1.8. and his estimated glomerular filtration rate was 53. So as we go through the lecture, I'll come back to Mr. C periodically just to help you interpret his labs and put them in the context of what we do in clinic. So the questions we're going to try to answer are as follows. Number one, is Mr. C's condition improving based on his estimated glomerular filtration rate? Remember, about a few months ago, he was at 56 GFR and he's at 53 today. Number two, is Mr. C at risk of kidney disease progression? And if so, why? And number three, are there other metabolic complications from his kidney disease that are being monitored or should be monitored? So let's step back and think about what kidneys do on a daily basis. They are amazing organs. Of course, I'm totally biased as a nephrologist. But we are all blessed, or most of us are blessed with having two kidneys, two bean-shaped structures that are closer to our back. And the kidneys, and I don't know if you can see my pointer or my arrow here, the unfiltered blood goes into the kidneys through the renal artery, and it's distributed to the nephrons, or the filtering units of the kidneys, where the blood is filtered, it's cleaned, and then it is recollected and goes out of the kidneys through the renal vein. And the filtered blood goes back into the circulation. The filtrate, or the product of this filtration process, is what we know as the urine. So it is collected initially in small little tubes in the nephron, and ultimately it drains into the central part, what we call the renal pelvis, and then ultimately into the ureter, and then the two ureters connect into the bladder, and then we pee the urine out. So it seems like a very simple process. We do it all the time. We don't think about it. But at the heart of all this are these little structures, these little minions, if you will, called nephrons. And the nephrons, if we blow them up, look something like this. They're made up of a glomerulus, And that's a little tiny ball of blood vessels. Again, at this level, the unfiltered blood goes in. The filtration process happens in the glomerulus, and the filtered blood, the clean blood, goes out. And the urine starts collecting in these little tubules that ultimately go into the ureters, into the bladder, out the body. So to give you an idea of how much the kidneys do on a daily basis, or really on a minute-by-minute basis, about 25% of the cardiac output, so the blood that's pumped out by the heart, is delivered to the kidneys. And that results in about 1.2 to 1.3 liters of blood per minute that goes to the kidneys and has to be filtered. So as you can imagine, this is quite a taxing job. However, we are, again, blessed to have about 1 million nephrons per kidney. So that's an average number. Some of us are born with 800,000, some of us are born with 1.2 million. But on average, we have about 1 million nephrons per kidney. So we have probably more nephrons that we need to go through life. And that's part of the reason we can donate a whole kidney and still live with one remaining kidney with essentially no problems. So what do the kidneys do? As I mentioned, they clean the blood to maintain a normal blood composition. So all the chemicals that are in the blood have to stay within normal limits. And most of this is regulated by the kidney. Not all of it, but most of it. They also get rid of excess fluid. So any fluid you don't need, you get rid of through by peeing it out, essentially. And that's why when you have kidney disease, you sometimes start swelling up because the kidneys don't function normally. And that's what one of my colleagues here at UAB commonly described to patients as a washer and a dryer function, which I thought was very cute and pretty appropriate. But the kidneys do more than that. They also reclaim substances that the body needs that you do not want to lose. For example, you may filter sugar in the urine, but the body reclaims it because you don't want to lose or waste important substances that provide you energy. You reclaim, amino acids, building blocks of protein, so on and so forth. So a lot of stuff that are filtered at the beginning get reabsorbed by the kidneys before the urine leaves the body. But the kidneys also have hormonal functions, and two important hormonal functions the kidneys do are, number one, they produce erythropoietin, which is a hormone that tells your body to make new red blood cells. And number two, it provides an important step in the activation of vitamin D. And active vitamin D is important for the health of your bones, certainly, but also seems to play an important role in your immune system and vascular health. And so, again, has consequences on a lot of issues. So with that, keep these hormonal functions in mind because we'll get back to them when we talk about metabolic problems that happen when kidneys don't work as properly as they should. So how would we assess kidney function, these washing and drying functions of the kidneys? To do that, we want to measure glomerular filtration rate. So the ability of the kidneys to clean or filter the blood. And when we talk about glomerular filtration rate, or GFR for short, we're talking about the combined function of all these millions of nephrons at once. So to do that, we would need a marker, a substance that would be eliminated through the kidneys via filtration. The substance should be filtered into the urine easily. The kidneys should not secrete it or reabsorb it. And when you give that marker, if you were to inject it into the body, it should not affect kidney function. Otherwise, it will change what you're trying to measure. So that's what we call an ideal marker. And these exist. And they allow you to measure glomerular filtration rate. So note that little m in front of the GFR. That means measured glomerular filtration rate. And these substances, again, exist. But using them is not practical. Most of them have to be injected. In order to measure the kidney function, you'll have to be in a research lab. You may have to have multiple blood draw or urine sample collected. It may take hours to come up with a measured glomerular filtration rate. So clearly, in practice, when you're coming to clinic to see your doctor, you cannot have your glomerular filtration rate measured. So what we rely on is an estimation of the glomerular filtration rate, or eGFR, And to do that, we rely on markers that are endogenous. They're already inside the body, and we just measure them. And the most common marker used is the creatinine. Some, for the pediatric population especially, may use cystatin. And I'm not going to talk about cystatin today, but I could answer questions if needed. So let's focus on creatinine. And why did the creatinine get picked as the best marker to use? In clinical settings, again, the creatinine is easy to measure. It's relatively cheap to measure it. It results from the normal muscle breakdown. So typically, it is generated at a steady rate. And because our muscle mass doesn't change too drastically from day to day, it's fairly steady. The production of creatinine is fairly steady. So the healthy kidneys would then take that creatinine out of the blood and dump it into the urine to leave the body. When the kidneys don't work well or are not working at full capacity, then the creatinine starts building up in the blood. So the concept is pretty simple. You're producing it at a steady rate. If your kidneys are working fine, you dump what you need to dump and the creatinine value is within normal limits. If your kidneys are not working well and they cannot get rid of the creatinine efficiently, then the creatinine will build up in the blood and you'll have values that are above the normal limits. So it made sense that we turned to creatinine for estimation of glomerular filtration rate. But the creatinine value has its limitations, and these I'm going to spend some time on because I think a lot of angst is related to the creatinine measurements that you see in the lab when you get your labs back. The first limitation of the creatinine is that, well, it's really an advantage and a limitation, is that as you lose kidney function at the beginning, the body is able to compensate for that and keeps the creatinine value within normal limits. So I promise I'll show you only 2 scientific slides for the whole talk, and that's one of them. And this is something we've known for quite some time. So this is a landmark article in 1985, but we've known for a while that if you bear with me and look at this slide, on the x-axis here at the bottom is true filtration rate measured. So this is the kidney function measured. And on the y-axis is your serum creatinine. So as I mentioned, as you lose kidney function, so you go from the higher number to the lower number, the creatinine value has to come up. So that makes sense. Now, for this particular study and this particular lab, the upper limit of the creatinine was 1.4. And 2 things are worth mentioning. Every dot on this slide is the value for one single patient. And you can see that even within the normal limit, there's a scatter of numbers. So not everybody has the same normal GFR. So that's important to keep in mind. We never know where you started off from. Your baseline best GFR could be 120, could be 140, no idea. But importantly, you can see that in a normal creatinine value, you can have people with GFRs as high as 160, and you can have people with GFRs as low as 70. And so it really takes a while, or I shouldn't say 70, maybe 90. But it takes a while to start seeing the serum creatinine rise above normal, even as you're losing some kidney function. In a way, that's what you want your kidneys to do, right? You want them to be able to compensate so that not every time you lose a little bit of function, your blood composition goes out of whack and you have all sorts of abnormalities. The problem is when you're measuring these values, you may not notice any change in your normal values as you're losing kidney function. So that's one limitation of the creatinine. The other limitation of the creatinine is that it's affected by multiple variables. One of them, I mentioned already, is your muscle mass. So if you were all buffed up like this and you had your serum creatinine measured, surely you would have a creatinine higher than my creatinine. I don't have nearly that muscle mass, so my serum creatinine should be lower. Creatinine is also affected by aging. As we age, we all lose muscle mass. You hear that quite often. Oops, sorry. And so as we go from normal adults to elderly, the serum creatinine under normal circumstances should trend down. There's also a difference in creatinine values between men and women. Again, this goes back to the idea of men having more muscles than women. And so usually within the normal range, men tend to have serum creatinine values at the higher end of the normal range, whereas women have it at the lower end of the normal range. And again, these are generalities, but they're true in most cases. Creatinine release into the urine is affected by medications, and most physicians, I would say all physicians almost, are pretty aware of those. But so again, if you're on a particular antibiotic or a particular medication that interferes with the creatinine assay or interferes with the creatinine release into the urine, then you will see a rise in serum creatinine. That may or may not mean anything for your kidney function. Of course, your kidney function would look like it's declining, but in the right context, the doctor would tell you, don't worry about it, may be related to the medicine you're on. And so again, that may not have, it shouldn't generate any anxiety on your part. Finally, we hear a lot about the concern over protein intake. And there are studies that show that if you ingest a large amount of meat, cooked meat for a meal, for example, and you come to the lab and have your serum creatinine checked shortly after, you will see a rise in serum creatinine. Remember, these are muscles and they have creatinine in them. And so they interfere or they can contribute to the creatinine value in the blood. These are transient changes, but again, depending on when you happen to have your blood drawn, may affect you, okay? So we'll come back to some of those variables. Because of these contributions, then scientists try, instead of relying just on the serum creatinine, they try to develop formulas that estimate the glomerular filtration rate, that use serum creatinine, but also take into account all these other things I talked about, or most of them. So two main formulas have been developed. And invariably, when you go to your lab and they report your GFR, you may see it on the lab report or it may be on the back end, but essentially the lab reports your glomerular filtration rate using either what we call the MDRD formula or the CKD epi formula. Not important to know what these abbreviations stand for. Suffice it to say that these are mathematical formulas that were developed and validated and that take into account, of course, your serum creatinine, but also your age. Again, remember, the older you are, the lower your serum creatinine should get. It takes into account your gender. If you're a woman, you have less muscle mass, so your serum creatinine should be lower. And takes into account your race. Again, here, the idea is that African Americans have, in general, a higher muscle mass than Caucasian patients. And that's being contested, but for the time being, these formulas include these four variables. And so what you see on your lab report is a serum creatinine value and a glomerular filtration rate value, an estimation of your glomerular filtration rate. But on the back end, all these variables were taken into account when generating the formula, the value, I'm sorry. CKD epi, the formula is even more complex, so I did not write it down. Having said that, it takes into account, again, age, gender, race, and serum creatinine. And these formulas were initially developed in a Caucasian African-American population, but they were validated in other races. So in Asia and so on and so forth, they've done special validation. So that number that we're using here, for example, for African-Americans may be different if you're applying this formula to our friends that may be listening to us that are in India, for example, or in China or somewhere else. The other thing that happened over the years is that we standardized creatinine values. So the creatinine values that the lab use is validated or standardized against gold standard. And so every lab calibrates their machine and so on and so forth to minimize the variability of these creatinine values. But you will note, and you should probably look back at your lab values, if you've gone to multiple labs to have your blood drawn, you will see that, for example, at UAB, your creatinine value normal limits may be 0.6 to 1.3. You go to the lab at another hospital or another outlying lab, and the normal value range may be 0.5 to 1.2. So if you have a creatinine of 1.2 in one and 1.3 in the other lab, these are essentially the same kidney function. They're just a matter of a different range or standardized creatinine value. I will also mention that the creatinine has intrinsic variability. Like any chemical reaction or assay that you do, if you were to repeat the same value 3 times in a row, or within the same day, you may get values that are a little bit different by 0.1 usually in most labs that have tight standardization. That's true of your blood pressure. That's true of your weight. If you weigh yourself 2-3 times in a day, you'll see that you'll have a little bit of variation. That doesn't mean much in terms from a physiologic standpoint. Finally, there are physiologic changes to your creatinine. So for example, if you get dehydrated, your creatinine value will go up. That's your body trying to conserve everything it can in terms of salt and fluid. And so it doesn't filter as much. That's what you want it to do. So if your creatinine is up that day and you haven't, drank a whole lot of fluid, and then you come back and you recheck your creatinine and it's back down, again, this may be within the physiologic changes that we see. These changes the physiologic changes become a little more magnified when you have kidney disease. In the normal range, you might not pick up on changes in the creatinine, again, because you have this capacity, the kidneys have the capacity to compensate much more. So to come back to our patient, he had a creatinine value of 1.7 today, and he was 1.8 last time. That translates into a difference in his GFR of 3 milliliters per minute, adjusted for his body surface area. So the question is this significant? And I would argue that no, that is not significant, unless you see a trend where the creatinine is consistently rising. So the next visit he comes and it's now 1.9 or 2, that's a different story. But if he comes back and it's again 1.7 or 1.6, so within the margin of errors, these don't necessarily mean a whole lot, not in a positive way and not in a negative way, which is what most people get alarmed about. So once you've measured your glomerular filtration rate, then again, to make the messaging about kidney disease a little easier, the National Kidney Foundation decided to develop a staging system because it's easier perhaps for patients to remember what stage they're at, and it also gives you a perspective of where you are on the spectrum of disease. So with that, they created this nice cartoon that often we give to patients just to give them a visual of what it looks like. So here's your glomerular filtration rate. Anything between 60 and above 60 is considered normal. And you could still have kidney disease and have a normal glomerular filtration rate. I think most of you may have witnessed that or lived that. So if you have protein in the urine, blood in the urine, an abnormal ultrasound, anything that suggests kidney disease, even though your kidneys are still able to clean the blood, they're really not normal. So those cases are classified as stages 1 and 2, early stages of kidney disease. Anything below 60, but above a GFR of 30 is called CKD stage 3. Between 15 and 30 is called CKD stage 4. And below 15 is called CKD stage 5. Now, some will call this kidney failure. We're really changing or moving away from that nomenclature because often at that point in time, you have advanced kidney disease, but your kidneys have not really failed. Be that as it may, you may hear both terms used, but CKD stage 5 is essentially a time when you're getting close to potentially needing renal replacement therapy at some point in time, and that's why the color coding, they put it in red so that people are alert to the fact that, yes, they have advanced disease and they need to prepare for renal replacement therapy, be it transplantation, dialysis, or the option to do medical therapy and not do either, which again may be a good option for some patients. So again, just to emphasize the importance when you're checking your creatinine value and your GFR value is the trend over time. This is an example of a patient of mine that I followed for almost 10 years now. And you can see at a glance that clearly he's progressed over time. He's not at the point where he needs dialysis yet, but he's certainly close enough. And you can see that along the way, there are ups and downs in his GFR, and there are ups and downs in his creatinine, of course. But the trend is pretty clear, and that there is a constant decline in kidney function. So we focus less on the small variation and more on the kind of trend. Are we moving, is the kidney function declining or is it stable? So let's move on to the second important measure of kidney health, and that's the urine. Again, we pee all the time. We don't think about it. We don't look at our urine most of the time, but the urine is an important part of assessing for kidney health. The normal urine contains no blood and no protein. And once you start leaking either one or both, then there's something wrong with that filtration process. And it can sometimes, often actually, be the earliest sign of kidney disease. So the easiest way to assess or to check on your urine is to do something called a urine dipstick. You'll hear that again when you go to see your doctor. And essentially, what you do is you dip a stick into the urine and look at it. So this is the stick and what it looks like. They dip it into the urine. You wait a few seconds for it to develop. And then you have this colorimetric chart. So a bunch of parameters in the urine. And you have a list of what's normal and what's abnormal. And among those things that you check for are protein and blood. So this is, again, cheap, easy, quick, very, very helpful to do routine screening. My kids go to the pediatrician, they get the urine test done. It's perfect. If you find an abnormality, then the next step is, number one, to make sure it's persistent. So transient small changes may, again, not be very important. But let's say it's persistent and you have protein in the urine, then you want to be able to quantify it. How much protein am I spilling in the urine? So again, to emphasize, healthy kidneys filter the blood, but don't let anything that you don't want to leak into the urine, particularly protein. And when that filter is damaged, then things start leaking into the urine, including protein. This is a particular kind of protein called albumin, but regardless, you could quantify for total amount of protein. And you really want to know how much protein are you leaking. And to do that, here again, we compromise. We have the gold standard, which is the 24-hour urine collection, which if done accurately is more accurate, but more cumbersome to do, versus a random urine test where you walk into the doctor's office, you pee in a cup, and the lab is reported within an hour or so. So this is a reasonable alternative. It is practical. And again, to account for some of the variability or make it a little more accurate, we do something called a urine protein to creatinine ratio. So we divide the protein concentration in the urine by the creatinine concentration in the urine and come up with what you all may commonly refer to as UPCR, or that you may hear your doctor talk about UPCR. Remember, the comparison between these two is valid, but these are apples and oranges. And I'll go through that a little bit because, again, people tend to equate the two. They're related, but not equal, okay? When you do a 24-hour collection, it's also very important that you do it appropriately. Otherwise, if you miss a urine here or there, it's not accurate. It's accurate only if done properly. And when we quantify for protein, we typically have to keep the sample cool. So as you can imagine, if you're going to work or going to school, you essentially will have to carry that jug with you all day long, which most people don't want to do, and I understand. So for our patient, his 24-hour urine protein in a 24-hour collection was 2,400 milligrams, and his spot urine protein to creatinine ratio was 1.6 gram per gram. And you say, how are these two numbers the same? They're not. They're related. So again, in the random urine, we express the value as grams of protein per gram of creatinine. To go back to the whole concept of muscle mass, if you in a day secrete or release a gram of creatinine in a 24-hour, based on what your body generates and what your kidneys get rid of, then yes, these two values would be the same. But if you are a male, and in this case, maybe a muscular male, then in his 24-hour urine, if you remember, in the 24-hour urine collection, he had about 1.5 grams of creatinine. That means if we multiply 1.6 by 1.5, you will roughly come up with this 2,400 milligram value. So then you can compare them as being equivalent. So why is this important? I mean, why are these minutiae important? They're important because the amount of protein you spill in the urine determines, or at least we know for now, is one of the major determinants of your outcome, your kidney outcome. This is the second scientific slide that I'm going to show you from a landmark article in which patients with IgA nephropathy were categorized as having, different levels of protein in the urine. The lowest level of protein all the way to the highest level of protein. And you can see on this axis here is survival from kidney failure. So essentially, the top number, everybody's kidneys were working. Over the years, the ones that had the most protein in the urine lost kidney function the fastest. And if you go down the line, the lowest amount of protein, your kidney function will remain stable and you will not lose kidney function, meaning you will not need to be on dialysis for a long, long time, 15 years in this particular case. Importantly, if you're able to change the amount of protein you're spilling in the urine, so you start by having 2 grams when you're first diagnosed and you're on no medication, but now you have, your doctor is, treating you, you're getting medications, you're getting your blood pressure under control, so on and so forth, and your protein level goes down, you can change your prognosis, you can change your outcome by doing these interventions. Notice that these values are based on 24-hour collections, so these are values per day. So when you do your UPCR, your doctor, in the back of his or her mind, should be converting these values, or at least thinking, are you at goal or at target? And if not, what else can we do to get you to target? Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. These are the limitations of the science and the treatments we have, but we certainly strive to get you there. Strive to get you there. So when you combine these two parameters, the glomerular filtration rate and the amount of protein you're spilling in the urine, then the guidelines, again put forth by KDIGO, which are essentially international guidelines that nephrologists and treating physicians use, came up with what we call the heat map. And essentially, the idea was to emphasize that the lower your glomerular filtration rate, so as you go down these values, I lost my point right here. As you go down the stages of kidney disease and your glomerular filtration rate is lower, your risk of developing end-stage kidney disease or progressing is high. It becomes in the red zone. And as you spill more and more protein going towards the right of the slide, again, your risk becomes higher. And the idea was, again, increasing public awareness about kidney disease, but also the importance of the protein in the urine, but also helping, from a public health perspective, primary care physicians who are at the forefront, or pediatricians for that matter, that are at the forefront of treating patients like you, know when should they refer to a nephrologist or a kidney specialist. So if somebody has very mild abnormalities, they may treat you before they get you to a nephrologist. But if your primary care physician picks up on a kidney disease and you're already in the red zone, you absolutely need to see a nephrologist right then and there. So these are, again, guidance. They're not written in stone, but they help patients, providers, specialists, so on and so forth. And they help us speak the same language as well. When I say my patient has CKD stage 3, you should understand that, your other physicians should understand that, and I should understand that. All right, so shifting gears, let's talk about metabolic complications that come up when your kidney function declines. And these, again, are things we monitor for and we treat for. And if you think of your normal healthy kidney function, then you will understand why you develop these metabolic complications and why we order all these blood tests when you come to clinic. I know it sounds like we are vampires and just like to suck blood out, but that's not the case. So the first metabolic complication is something called anemia, or low red blood cell count. And anemia develops because your kidneys, if they're not working properly, cannot make enough of that hormone that I mentioned called erythropoietin. But your body also develops resistance to erythropoietin, and your red blood cells tend to live for shorter periods of time. So with all these reasons, your hemoglobin, which is the measure of anemia, and you will see it on your lab test abbreviated as HGB tends to go down, so you become anemic. Women are usually pretty familiar with anemia because often during pregnancy and stuff like that, you become anemic and people give you iron and so on and so forth. So it's not limited to kidney disease, but it can certainly be associated with kidney disease. And the treatment is to make sure you have enough iron on board. These are the building blocks to making new red blood cells. But sometimes we have to give people injections of erythropoietin or darbepoetin, essentially replacing the hormone that the kidneys would normally make. And we target not necessarily a normal hemoglobin level, but we keep the anemia in a safe range where people don't have usually any symptoms from it and don't certainly have any risk to their health from mild anemia. The second metabolic complication we monitor is hyperkalemia or high potassium. And the word kalemia comes from the actual chemical nomenclature from if you remember the chart of the ions that you studied in school, potassium is K, and that's what you will see on your lab. So we monitor the K level or potassium level. And the treatment, if your potassium goes up because you're not able to excrete it, is diet restriction. A lot of foods are high in potassium, especially good foods, healthy foods. So we don't want you to eliminate them from your diet, but certainly restrict them. We usually are careful using specific medication that can contribute to the high potassium. And we may sometimes have to take you off some of these medications. And then if that fails or we're not able to stop some of these medicines, then your doctor may give you a diuretic or a water pill to help you get rid of potassium. Next is metabolic acidosis, or acidosis for short. And acidosis is the buildup of acid in the blood. And the acid builds up for two reasons. One, you're not able to get rid of the acid that your body generates if your kidneys don't work properly. But they also cannot reclaim the bicarbonate, the buffer that helps keep the acid level in range. And so it's a double whammy. So how do we monitor for it? We measure something called the bicarbonate. Again, you will see it on your lab chemistry as CO2, the CO2 level in the blood. And to keep it or get it as close to normal as possible, we treat you with oral supplements of buffer. So what your body we cannot stop the acid generation, but we can give you buffers to keep the acid that's generated under control. So usually we'll prescribe either bicarbonate, typically tablets, or citrate solution, and we try to keep your bicarbonate level over 22. That also protects your kidneys from and extends the life of your kidneys if we can keep the acid level under control. Studies have shown that. Probably the most complicated metabolic consequence of kidney disease is what we call bone mineral disease. And the kidneys interact or are at the heart of a very complex interaction between the gut, where calcium and phosphorus is absorbed, the parathyroid glands, and the bones. And parathyroid glands are tiny little glands. I don't even know if you can see them. They're these yellow little glands that sit behind your thyroid, and the thyroid is up in your neck. And these glands go haywire when the kidneys are not working. So they start releasing a high level of parathyroid hormone, or PTH for short. Again, the whole idea is your body is trying to restore a normal blood composition. So when the phosphorus goes up in the blood and the calcium goes down, these glands start releasing parathyroid hormone to keep or restore normal values for calcium and phosphorus. So it's not without reason, but obviously when that goes overboard, it can be detrimental to your body. And then the bones, of course, are the major storage place where calcium and phosphorus is stored. And bones are constantly being destroyed and produced. So although they seem like they're this inert, organs, they really are not. So there's constantly what we call bone remodeling or bone turnover. New bone is laid down and old bone is destroyed. And to do so, they need to exchange calcium and phosphorus from the blood to be able to make new bone. So when the kidneys don't work, again, things don't function properly. And the most common disease, bone disease we see, is something called high bone turnover, meaning there's more bone destruction than bone production. And it's usually related to a high phosphorus level in the blood, decreased production of active vitamin D. Remember, the second hormonal function that I mentioned is activation of vitamin D at the level of the kidneys, and this elevated PTH level from these glands that become overactive. So again, we monitor the blood for calcium levels, phosphorus, PTH, and vitamin D levels. And the treatment is to reduce the phosphorus level by restricting it in the diet, raising the calcium if we need to, and repleting vitamin D by giving you extra vitamin D supplementation. Bone mineral disease is complex, but just know, again, when you see this slew of labs, there's a reason all of these are ordered, especially when you have CKD stage 3, 4, and 5. Early on, these metabolic problems do not happen, so you don't necessarily need to be monitored for these things. So at the end of it, I hope you don't look like that. I am not seeing your video, so I have not seen anybody cry yet, but if you do look like this and you don't understand any of it, please feel free to ask questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Rizek. That was a very informative presentation, and I certainly learned a lot, and I've been getting labs for over 15 years, so I think it was great information. We do have some questions from people that have been watching.
Sure.
First off, someone wants to know, if I drink extra water or eat more clean before labs, does that make a difference in results, and what do you recommend?
So yes, it can make a difference in the results. You definitely don't want to go to the lab when you're dehydrated. Keep in mind, your doctor may ask you to fast to do, for example, lipid profile or something like that. You can still drink water, but not eat. It makes a difference in that you know, I am sure it's anxiety generating to see your creatinine go up, even if your doctor says it's only because you're a little dry or dehydrated today. So I would say be consistent. If you are going to the lab and you have plenty of advance notice that you're going to the lab, hydrate, do the same thing every time. So at least you can compare, again, apples to apples, and you can tell if the change in your value is just a physiologic change because you're a little dry, or if it's a real reflection of kidney function changing.
You were talking about medications that it can affect creatinine, and you mentioned antibiotics. Do ARBs or the other blood pressure lowering medication also affect the creatinine production?
So when I was mentioning antibiotics, the classic antibiotic is something called Bactrim, or sulfamethoxazole is the generic name for it. Those can raise serum creatinine. But to answer your question, the angiotensin receptor blocker and ACE inhibitor, or angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, by design, decrease the pressure inside this glomerulus. So the filtering unit of the kidney, the single unit that looks like a ball of blood vessel, the higher the pressure inside that filtering unit, the more protein you leak in the urine. And so the ACE and ARB reduce that pressure inside the filtering unit. And in doing so, it reduces the filtration a little bit, and it causes a rise in serum creatinine. When your kidney function is normal and you take these medicines, you do not have any change in your labs. You don't see it. But if you have advanced kidney disease, you could see a small change in your serum creatinine. And we usually will allow a 15 to 20% change in serum creatinine values and chuck it up to ACE and ARB. Having said that, this in the long run is protective for your kidneys. So that small bump in serum creatinine is, number one, reversible. You stop the medicine, it goes away. So it may again alarm you, but it does not reflect change in your true kidney function. Number two, it's protective in the long run. So yes, if you have just started the medicine and your kidney function is not normal and you see a small change in your serum creatinine and your doctor says that's okay, that's probably is okay because it's expected. Does that answer your question?
It sounds like it, yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a difference between the albumin creatinine ratio and the protein creatinine ratio?
Yes. So most of the protein we spill, if the protein you spill in the urine could be coming anywhere from the filtering unit, so that little ball of blood vessel, or from the tubule, the drainage system of the kidney. And these are different kinds of protein. When you have a glomerular disease, such as IgA nephropathy, most of the protein you're recovering in the urine is from that glomerulus being sick. So most of it will be albumin. And the two values, again, are not identical, but they're equivalent. Meaning the more protein you spill, the more albumin you'll see in the urine. So the UPCR and the UACR should go up together and go down together. And roughly 2/3 of the protein that you spill will be albumin. So let's say you have a gram of protein in the urine, maybe 600 milligram of that would be albumin, and the rest would be other kinds of protein that your body is wasting or losing through that filter that's sick. Importantly, when we look at prognostic data, most of the data, for example, in diabetic patient, is related to the ACR, or albumin to creatinine ratio. In glomerular diseases, most of the data we have that tells us how well patients are going to do long-term is related to protein in the urine. So again, if you've had a UACR, no big deal. Most of the time, I mean, if you know what that means, you can extrapolate and figure out what the protein level in the urine is. But if you are scientific and following, like targeting a UPCR value, it's easier to measure UPCR.
And so someone's asking the difference between PCR and ACR values.
So the UPCR value is typically higher than the UACR value. And the UACR value would be, in general, for glomerular diseases, IgA being one of them, will be about 2/3 the value of the UPCR.
And is it normal for a lab to include the ACR or PCR on the lab results that you see?
If you order it, so most labs will report whatever you order as a doctor. So if your doctor is following up on both values, then yes, you will see both of them. Most of the time, we'll be following on one or the other.
Someone's asking about a kappa lambda free ratio test. How is this related to the kidneys?
Good question. Unrelated to IgA nephropathy. So the kappa and lambda are, again, a perfect example of kinds of proteins that are filtered in the urine. We all have kappa and lambda floating around and your body gets rid of it. If you have kidney disease, they can accumulate. So again, when you look at the kappa to lambda ratio, it may be a little bit abnormal. That's not alarming when you're not able to filter these proteins out. If your doctor is concerned about that ratio being really high, then he's looking for something else. They may be looking for a reason why you have blood abnormalities or something like that. We do it when people have multiple myeloma, so a type of blood cancer. So the free ratio test is done sometimes at the beginning when we're looking for a cause for kidney disease. I'm not sure in what context it was done, but it can be mildly abnormal when people have abnormal kidney function. And it may, again, it's just a reflection of the fact, just like your creatinine goes up, the kappa to lambda ratio becomes abnormal.
Why is cystatin-based GFR test not used more commonly?
Good question. I don't know who asked the question. I don't know if it's a mom of a child or an adult. In adult, cystatin C, number one, is more expensive. It is not as validated. So remember, I told you it took years to calibrate the creatinine and make all the labs kind of be able to measure the creatinine against a gold standard to make it really as reliable as possible. That is in the works for cystatin C. It has not been yet as validated as creatinine. It's a newer lab as well. Number three, it can be affected by conditions that cause significant inflammation. So in adults, you can imagine you can have, arthritis, and you can have heart disease, and you can have a lot of things that can interfere with the cystatin C. So you go back again to interference on the lab test. And so for all these reasons, more expensive, less available, less validated, and with potential interference, it is not used as much. In children, where the muscle mass is changing sometimes quite rapidly. So you can see a teenager who grows 4 or 5 inches in a year. the creatinine is a problem because their muscle mass is changing all the time. So, and they don't usually have other conditions that cause significant inflammation that would interfere with the cystatin. So pediatricians would often use the cystatin-based EGFR in those situations. So I hope that answers your question, but adults and children, the use of cystatin C is a little bit different.
Well, Dr. Rizek, we're running up against some time constraints. We have a few more questions. Kerry will mail you the copies, and then hopefully we can get answers back to our patients that were watching. We appreciate your time, a great presentation, very informative, and I certainly know I learned a lot. I hope everybody else in the audience did as well. So thank you so much for your time and for your efforts on our behalf. So thank you.
No problem, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes, well, you're welcome. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is going to be from Alnylam, and they are working on a phase 1 clinical trial. So we'll bring you their presentation next.
Great, thanks so much. I'll just load that up right now. There we go. Hopefully that's all loaded for you. So thanks to the organizers of the conference and to all of you for being here tonight. My name is Ishir Ban. I'm a nephrologist working at Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. We're investigating a therapy called cemdisiran that takes a different approach to potentially treating IgA nephropathy. I'd like to share some information about our cemdisiran clinical development program, including our phase 2 clinical trial, which is currently enrolling. So let me start by telling you a little bit about Alnylam. We're based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're a global commercial company, and we're leaders in something called RNA interference or RNAi technology, which I'll explain a little more tonight. We have a commitment to scientific excellence and a robust product portfolio, and really what drives us is that we're committed to patients, their families, and caregivers. As you can see, we have 26 offices over 18 countries. And the company was founded in 2002 and now has over 1,200 employees, 10 programs in clinical development, and 2 approved products. So let's talk about one way to think about disease. There's a concept out there that there are many diseases can be thought of as an imbalance of protein. In a healthy individual, a balanced state of protein creation and recycling leads to normal cellular health. In some diseases, an imbalance in protein generation and recycling can lead to illness. To find ways to treat these types of diseases, we need to understand how proteins are made. So your body's DNA contains the instructions to make all the proteins that your body produces. To create a specific protein, a piece of DNA, the gene, is copied to make RNA. RNA is the messenger that carries the instructions to make the proteins. RNA is what's then processed to actually make the protein. So once the DNA gets turned into RNA, the RNA will then take the message to the appropriate place for the body to produce the protein. So RNAi utilizes a natural process to stop these RNA messages and thereby reducing the amount of protein that's made. At Alnylam, we harness the power of RNAi to target proteins that contribute to disease. And by targeting specific RNA messages, that results in less protein being made. So RNAi or RNA interference is a new approach to drug discovery and development. It's shown potential since the 1990s. The first scientific report of RNAi dates back to an experiment which I really find amusing, in which 2 scientists, a husband and wife, had the idea that they wanted to take these violet petunias and turn them into a deeper shade of violet. And so they boosted the gene that makes the violet pigment, and they expected to see darker flowers as a result. But instead, they got a range of different flowers, some of which were totally white, completely unexpected. And so they looked into the biology here, and they discovered this phenomenon of RNA interference, where there could be a process that interrupts this messenger and actually reduces instead of increases the amount of protein. This eventually led to a Nobel Prize in 2006. The first drug based on RNAi was submitted for FDA approval in 2017. And we now have two therapies that have been approved by the FDA and the European EMA for rare diseases that are on the market right now. So let's talk a bit about IgA nephropathy, or IgAN. You heard a bit about that in the previous talk. Some of the specifics that we look at. IgA nephropathy is thought to result from problems with the regulation of immunoglobulin A. It's a type of antibody protein that can target surfaces of the mouth, nose, intestine, also known as mucosal surfaces. In IgAN, certain forms of IgA can cluster with other proteins and deposit in the kidney, and this causes the immune system to react to them and cause damage in the kidney. And as you heard about in the previous talk, this can cause protein and blood to leak into the urine, and that we can look for that as evidence of the disease, known as proteinuria and hematuria. It can also affect kidney function over time, the glomerular filtration rate, as you heard about. Now, proteinuria, as you saw, is thought to be a particularly important measure of disease severity because patients with low levels of protein in the urine usually have a low risk of disease progression. Whereas if you have more protein in the urine, your chance of progressing is higher. So that's been a big focus of therapy, is to look at what we can do to change the amount of protein in the urine. Even with current treatments, up to 40% of affected people may develop end-stage kidney disease over time, which may require dialysis or kidney transplantation. And to date, there are no approved disease-specific treatments available. General interventions that may be used in many forms of kidney disease have been used to try to slow disease progression, such as angiotensin-converting enzyme, or ACE inhibitors, or angiotensin II receptor blockers, or ARBs, that are also used for blood pressure control. Drugs like steroids, with or without other immunosuppressive agents, are also used in some patients. So kidney disease in IgAN may be driven by part of the immune system called the complement pathway. And I know this figure looks very complicated and has multiple parts in it, but I'm just going to focus on a few key elements. Numerous companies and scientists are interested in the potential of blocking this pathway to treat different diseases. And studies from some of these therapies suggest that blocking the complement pathway may benefit people with IgAN. Cemdisiran, which is the RNAi-based therapy being developed for IgAN by our company, Alnylam, specifically targets a protein called C5 toward the end of this whole pathway, blocking all forms of complement that have been implicated in IgA nephropathy. So, in other words, cemdisiran works by decreasing the levels of this C5 protein in the complement pathway. It's not a pill or an infusion, but rather an injection that's administered under the skin, and in its current form is being given about once a month. An initial phase 1 study in participants without kidney disease suggested that cemdisiran was suitable to move on to a larger phase 2 clinical trial. And a phase 2 trial is what we're currently enrolling participants in to study the safety of cemdisiran and to see if it can decrease the amount of protein leaked by the kidneys, which we know is an important measure of how bad the disease is affecting the kidneys. We're also looking to see if it can potentially address other consequences of IgA nephropathy. And what we call the therapeutic hypothesis, the reason we believe this therapy could work, is that by reducing the amount of C5 protein, we can help reduce the IgA nephropathy associated kidney damage. So this is the phase 2 study that is currently enrolling. It is an investigational trial of cemdisiran in adults with biopsy-proven IgAN who have both blood and protein in their urine. Our planned enrollment is 30 participants total, and eligible individuals must be on the standard of care with stable treatment with an ACE inhibitor or ARB before and throughout the trial. They cannot have been on steroids or immunosuppressive drugs within the past 6 months, and they must have a sufficient level of renal function with an estimated GFR of at least 30 mils per minute. The main endpoint we are looking for is a reduction in the urine protein. as measured by the urine protein creatinine ratio that you heard about. Various other measures are also being studied. There's a run-in period before patients get any treatment to ensure that stability is present before we start treatment. And the treatment period consists of monthly injections given under the skin. Now, this is what's called a randomized trial. So 2/3 of the participants will get cemdisiran, our therapy, and 1/3 will get a placebo injection for the first 9 months. There are no invasive or imaging procedures, such as biopsies or x-rays, required during the study itself. The full inclusion-exclusion criteria for the study and other trial details are on the website clinicaltrials.gov. And there's also a flyer that's being made available. At the end of the phase 2 trial, we'll do an analysis to determine if it makes sense to move on to a larger phase 3 trial that could lead to approval and availability of the drug widely on the market. So I want to thank you all for your time tonight, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bond, for your presentation, and very informative, and looks like you guys have some very interesting challenges ahead, and hopefully we can move forward and find a cure. At this point, we do not have any questions from the audience. We do want to thank Alnylam for their sponsorship of Spark as a Fireworks Sparkler sponsor. We appreciate your support of the foundation financially, and also in your support to try to help find a cure for our disease. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we really appreciate you being here.
And thank you for having me. Our pleasure.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was such a great explanation of just getting right down to the meat of how the drug works.
Yeah.
I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions, and Carrie, as you do so well, we can forward them over.
That'd be great. Thanks
Yeah,
so much.
and I'll email out the flyer to everyone by next week.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you everyone so much. We really appreciate it. And this will be probably up on our YouTube channel, IgA Nephropathy Foundation. I would imagine, what is it normally a week we run behind each episode?
Yeah, last week's is taking a little longer because we have some review stuff that's got to go through, but the rest should be moving quickly. I think we have all the way through week 3 up there now.
So you'll be able to check your views by just going on to YouTube and look for IgA Nephropathy Foundation, and you can kind of follow it. And we'll be obviously promoting this as well on our trials and research group, our new site, Facebook.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Don't forget to join us next week, where the topic is going to be finding your own living donor. You can see more details on our website, www.spark.org/2020, and hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you
Good night.
guys so much. Thanks everybody for joining.